Joining us now on the Cubs Talk podcast is a very special guest. He and I have crossed paths once or twice in the past, and I'm always a big fan of his prospect breakdowns for the Cubs. His name is Greg Huss. He is the host of the Cubs On Deck podcast and a co-founder of Northside Bound. You can find him on Twitter, currently known as X, at Out of the Vines. Greg, really great to have you on to talk some Cubs prospects and just kind of all things about this organization today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, James. I appreciate you having me on, and hopefully bringing a little bit of encouragement in what is not the most fun time to be a Cubs Major League fan. So hopefully we can bring some prospect optimism into the mix here.
Yeah, you're really kind of preaching to the choir and putting things very bluntly with where the Cubs are at right now. Certainly in kind of a sell mode right now. We know that Jed Hoyer has said that the team is looking to more so build for next season as opposed to trying to get a bunch of prospects to compete in 2027. So I'm just going to kind of, frame the question to you this way, Greg. We are 5 days away from that MLB trade deadline. The Cubs are probably going to be focused on getting guys who can give them more immediate help. As a prospect guru, I'm kind of curious to know from you if you think the Cubs are going to dip into that prospect pool that they have to get guys that are going to be able to help them next season. And if you think ultimately that is the right move for where this team currently is in their contention window or lack thereof.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. When we're talking about the trade deadline, a lot of times you look at, are they buyers, are they sellers, and it's got to be one or the other. I don't think it necessarily needs to be like a hard buy or a hard sell. Any trades that the Cubs make are with the intention of competing next year. So they could buy somebody who could help the team this year, but also be around for next year, the year after, the year after that. I'm looking at like a Michael Busch type of trade that happened this past offseason. Or it could also be the combination of that also with selling a guy like Jameson Taillon or Hector Neris or Mark Leiter Jr. or Mike Tauchman. But I think that they could dip into some of the prospect action if they are looking to truly acquire a player that helps them for next year, the year after that, like Michael Busch. Then some of those guys like James Triantos or Kevin Alcantara, maybe they become part of a package that helps them compete in future seasons.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the Busch trade. I thought that one was a tremendous example of kind of dealing from a position of strength where it's a guy who's likely still several years away from competing at the big league level in exchange for a guy who really had no avenue onto the big league roster for the Los Angeles Dodgers. I thought that was one of those trades that really did strike me as kind of being mutually beneficial and one the Cubs could potentially go after for the 2025 season. I do want to mention before we kind of get into the cream of the crop here, like the big name guys that are in the Cubs system still, I have to say there's been a lot of skepticism about the depth and the skill of that prospect pool based on the performances of some of the young guys that have kind of come up to the Cubs and really haven't shown out the way that we kind of thought they would. And I think that the guy who obviously headlines that list is Pete Crow-Armstrong, who was looked at as this potential 4 or even 5-tool player who was going to be able to hit for a good average, maybe add some power in there, and then, of course, just have the complete ability to dominate on the base paths and defensively. Those latter two things he's certainly been able to do, but his plate appearances have certainly left something to be desired. Before we get to the good aspects of this Cubs system, I do got to ask you, man, what is your kind of feeling of the way that PCA has struggled at the plate? And do you kind of see that turning around without, I don't know, perhaps a stint back in the minor leagues? What are your thoughts right now on the PCA experiment?
Yeah, the nice part about PCA is as far as people like me who watched him come up through the farm system, it's not that far off from what I expected to see from his first taste of major league action, right? Really, really struggling at the plate while he performs terrific in center field. He runs the bases. He's bringing value to the team elsewhere. And I think that fans' perspective of PCA would be different if the rest of the team was performing to the way that we hope they would perform, right? The rest of the lineup, the rest of the roster, because then at that point you could afford to have PCA struggling at the plate, but also bringing value elsewhere, right? Like he's a net positive player this year because defensively he's so good and on the bases he's so good. So like, I think that you look at PCA and obviously he's struggling, but I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But like you look at the rest of the roster, like I wish that the batters 1 through 8 of the lineup were picking it up to the point where we didn't need PCA to be an even average hitter at the plate. So like, I think my takeaway is that it's not far off from what I expected from PCA in his first taste of major league action. I think that the Cubs can afford to continue to give him playing time in Chicago and work through these growing pains over the course of this season and into next season, because it's going to take time. He's still super, super young. He still brings value to a lineup. You just can't expect him to be a even like 6 or 7 hole hitter next year. Even, if he's an 8 or 9 hole hitter and he's a below average hitter but still bringing that other value, then like I think you take that, right? Eventually you hope that he becomes more than that, obviously, but right now I'm not too worried. I think it's a pump the brakes type of situation with PCA. Enjoy what you're getting enjoy the good, and then let the bad kind of round it in shape a little bit better over the next couple of years.
I think what's perhaps most annoying to me out of all of that is that, yeah, there is a little bit of injury issue that's kind of at play there with him being thrust into a bigger role. Cody Bellinger specifically, you would think that that would kind of knock PCA into, a different spot in the lineup even. But you probably were not predicting that Dansby Swanson would have the complete fall off that he's had, where he's basically been a non-entity at the plate this season. The issue that I have, though, is you did go into the season with this idea that you knew the catching position was going to be very difficult to get consistent production out of. And we've seen that bear out with them getting rid of Yan Gomes. And now that they've got Tomas Nido and Miguel Amaya back there, granted, Amaya's been hitting a little bit recently, but it just seems to me that they did not really put PCA to be in a really successful position with some of those decisions. And I'll grant them the injuries and the Dansby Swansons of the world who have kind of underperformed. It just seems to me that they kind of short-circuited his development a little bit with just kind of the way that they've handled his presence in the lineup. Do you think that's a fair critique of the way they've handled PCA?
Yeah, I think it was kind of weird seeing him called up earlier this year and then sitting back down, where he killed it for a week and a half in Iowa, maybe 2 weeks in Iowa, and then called back up. It seemed like there was some short-sightedness with the way they were handling him. You point out those 3 positions, though. You point out PCA in center field, Dansby Swanson at shortstop, and then the catching tandem behind the plate. Those are the 3 positions that you want to focus primarily on defense. And then offense is any offense you get is just extra, right? So I don't know. It's kind of a unique situation with those 3 positions. Obviously, Miguel Amaya and whatever catching has been going on the major league roster, not good. Obviously, Dansby Swanson, not good. But you need to kind of supplement that elsewhere. Michael Busch has obviously been good this year. Ian Happ has had he's hot right now. Seiya Suzuki's had his times. Third base has been a black hole on offense for the most part. Like it's you got to supplement it with some really high end talent if you're punting on offense with 3 of those defensive positions, right? If you're punting on offense with center field, shortstop, and catcher, all 3 of them, then you have to have someone who's really, really good offensively in the other positions, and the Cubs don't really have that.
Yeah, you can't really grind your entire offense to a halt for an entire inning because you have 3 complete non-entities at the plate. I think you're absolutely correct about that. And definitely a valid criticism, I think, of the way that Jed Hoyer and Carter Hawkins have kind of put this team together. But we've spent the first few minutes of this podcast kind of focusing on a little bit of the bad in terms of the Cubs and kind of the position they find themselves in right now. Let's get to the good stuff. We know that this trade deadline is going to be an interesting one from a perspective of guys that are being sent out, but the guys the Cubs have been able to bring in over the last few seasons have really shown out well at the minor league level. And I think that's really well reflected in the top 30 prospects list that you just released. Really great stuff. Really loved your breakdowns and your discussions of that. Unshockingly, Cade Horton's the number 1 guy on that list. You love to see Moises Ballesteros flying up that list as well. He's been hitting really well in AAA. Owen Casey, another really young guy at the AAA level, also making some big strides forward this season. I think the thing that I love about those guys specifically is how young and comparatively raw they are and how they're really been strong at each level that they've gone up in the system. And now at the AAA level, I would love to hear your thoughts on just kind of the way the Cubs have been handling the development. Specifically, I think of Casey and Ballesteros and just the way that they've been able to kind of excel even as they've moved up that ladder at comparatively young ages.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of complaints about the Cubs not calling up Owen Casey and Moises Ballesteros to Chicago, and that they're slow in developing these guys, slow at pulling them up to Chicago. And man, I couldn't disagree more with the way that argument, right? You have Owen Casey, 21 years old, playing in AAA. He spent the entire year in AAA. You got Moises Ballesteros, 20 years old. He's in AAA. Like, these are young dudes that are yeah, like if they're killing it and if they're knocking down the door to Chicago, call them up. But like, I don't think you can make the argument that they're slow to call these guys up. They've been pretty aggressive with the promotions. I know that like they've warranted those calls because of how well they've performed, but like still, you look at the age, you look at the time they spent in the system. They've been pretty aggressive. Assigning Owen Casey to AAA to start off this year, assigning him to AA to start off last year. Like that's pretty impressive. That's good stuff. The way that the system's set up right now is very different than it was a year and a half ago or so, 2 years ago. Because a year and a half, 2 years ago, the Cubs had 11, 12 guys that were in the top like 150 or so in all of baseball, 150 to 200. Like there weren't a whole lot of dudes that were top 25, top 30 prospects in all of baseball, but they had a lot of depth in terms of 11 guys, top 150 or so. Some of
Right.
those guys have graduated. The Jordan Wicks, the PCA, the Ben Brown, those guys have graduated. So there's fewer of them. But now you're talking about 7 consensus top 100 prospects in all of baseball. A legit 7 dudes that are top 100. Cade Horton, Owen Casey, Matt Shaw, and Moises Ballesteros, which those guys are kind of like the top 50 type guys, top 60. And then you have James Triantos, Jefferson Rojas, and Kevin Alcantara, who are all in the back end of top 100. So like that's no joke. And I want to point out too that outside of PCA, the Cubs haven't really had a consensus top 100 guy that has graduated up to Chicago yet, right? Jordan Wicks was not a top 100 guy, like consensus top 100 guy. Ben
Yeah.
Brown is not that. The Cubs have not really had that yet. So like I know that people point to like Matt Mervis from a couple of years ago or Matt Mervis this year, and they're like, oh, wait, he was supposed to be legit and he ended up not being good. It's like, yeah, but he wasn't even sniffing top 100 lists. Like he was nowhere near that. Versus now, the Cubs potentially by the end of this season, the Cubs could have 7 guys that are top 100 guys all in AAA Iowa, which is kind of crazy. I don't know that's ever happened before, honestly.
I was actually literally going to ask you that because you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of the way that the Chicago White Sox kind of established Birmingham as the area where all of their truly top prospects were going to go. And I don't know if that was by design by the Cubs or if it's just kind of the way that it's been shaking out. But you point out the way that Iowa's roster could end up looking for the back half of this season. And man, let me tell you something. If you want to have appointment television, if you're a Cubs fan, fire up MLB TV and watch that Iowa Cubs roster. Do you think that that was something that the Cubs kind of deliberately designed to happen, or do you just kind of think that it just so happens that this wave is kind of all cresting at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's just the way it's kind of worked out because I know that when the White Sox did that with Birmingham a couple of years ago now, that was like a very concern. They really liked the coaching staff on the Birmingham Barons, I think is their situation. And so
Mhm.
they kind of shifted things to make it work that way. And like that was honestly kind of weird. I didn't understand. I've never seen that before. I didn't understand that. For the Cubs, it's just kind of worked out this way, where everyone's kind of landing in AAA at the same time. And I'll say that's I guess it's 6, not Jefferson Rojas, but the 6 of the other 7 will be in Iowa at the same time, more than likely here, unless a guy like Owen Casey gets called up to Chicago. But with all these six of these guys, it didn't really start off that way. I was talking a few years ago how the Cubs have really layered their system, that there was a lot of talent at each affiliate. And
Yep.
it really just kind of worked out. The guys have had, like Moises Ballesteros, who was much lower in the organization, hit so quickly that he made it up here. Cade Horton was supposed to be in Chicago right now, but he got injured, obviously. And so like he's still there. Like it just has kind of worked out that way. And it's made for my job of watching these prospects a whole lot more fun. That's for sure. It makes it easier. So I'm only watching 1 or 2 affiliates as opposed to all 4. I'm still watching all 4. Let's be honest.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's been kind of nice, like, on my travels around the US this year, I've kind of been all over the place and I've been able to see basically all of the Cubs affiliates. And it does kind of give you a good sense of where they're at in the development paths as you see Myrtle Beach, as you go out to South Bend, which is obviously not that far away. I saw West Tennessee play over in Chattanooga, which was really awesome. And it's just really been remarkable to see like the quality, talented players at each level of this system. And now it's kind of crescendoing where you're going to have all of these guys in Iowa at the same time. I do want to ask you about one guy in particular. I think that we've talked pretty extensively on this show, at least, about Matt Shaw and kind of the expectations for him as he comes up. I'm a lot more curious about Moises Ballesteros, just kind of given the fact that the Cubs obviously don't have a super deep pipeline of catchers, and they really have kind of struggled to identify one outside of Wilson Contreras in recent seasons. And I'm genuinely curious to hear from you. Do you project Moises Ballesteros to be a catcher in the big leagues, or do you see it as more likely that he maybe gets moved to different roles, even like a DHing role, perhaps first base? What are your thoughts on what we can expect out of Moises Ballesteros in the years to come?
I am not expecting him to be a catcher at the big league level. And
Mm,
I have actually been more impressed with his catching this year than I was last year. I think he's improved quite a bit behind the plate. I think that you're looking at a situation where his bat is so good that you're not going to be able to continue to develop him in the minors with his catching abilities, that you're going to have to call him up to Chicago. And I think at that point, like once he's up in Chicago, not to say that he's coming up and he's a DH first baseman and he can't ever return to being a catcher, but like it's kind of hard, like you don't really see that happen very often. I keep pointing out, I've heard a lot of calls for like, oh, well, maybe Moises Ballesteros can catch 2 or 3 times a week. Maybe he can be like a third catcher on the
mm.
Cubs roster. And that sounds great in theory, but that doesn't really exist. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like Mitch Garver is the only catcher I can think of in Major League Baseball that does that. Who's
Right.
who's good enough to be a starter in terms of his bat, but only catches 2 or 3 times a week. Mitch Garver is the only guy I can think of that does that. We think back to like the Kyle Schwarber days. Like that's what we said with Kyle Schwarber when he was coming up. It's like, oh, maybe he can catch 2 or 3 times a week,
Yep.
but it doesn't really happen, right? And so because Moises Ballesteros' bat is so good, and because there's question marks about his catching abilities, then I think what he ultimately ends up doing is playing DH or playing first base. And I think that's fine. I think the bat's good enough for that to be the case. I have him ranked 4th in my prospect rankings right now. And that is by far the highest I've ever ranked a guy that I view as a DH first base type in my 10 years of ranking the system. So I'm really high on Moises Ballesteros. And I want to say that like his defense is better. Like it is better. I'm not ruling it out yet. I just think that like I project him as a DH or first base moving forward, and I think that's perfectly fine.
Are you comparing him then to Kyle Schwarber? Just because like I'm just saying, like,
Yeah.
not that you obviously explicitly did, but like just the way you talked about it, the development path, the fact that the bat is such a potent weapon and you're not necessarily willing to, or needing, I should say, to wait on him to develop the defensive skills because you want to get that bat into the big leagues as soon as possible. And unlike when they did this with Kyle Schwarber, they do have that DH available on a consistent basis. Is that kind of a fair comp of how you would kind of see his development maybe outpacing what they're going to be able to have him do defensively?
The pacing is accurate. Like I like that. They're such different hitters, like so different in terms of the way they go about hitting. Where like if you think Kyle Schwarber, like the upside of Kyle Schwarber is huge, right? When he's out there hitting 40 plus home runs a season. But also, you looked at some of the down years of Kyle Schwarber, and he wasn't hitting 30 home runs, and he was also sporting a batting average super low. Like there was a much wider range of outcomes for Kyle Schwarber. I think that Moises Ballesteros has a higher floor, but a lower ceiling than what Kyle Schwarber had, just because of the way he goes about doing it is different, right? He's a guy who can work at bat really well. He can draw walks, but he also limits strikeouts quite a bit. He's done that throughout his entire career. Is limit the strikeouts. His bat to ball skills, I think, are really good. The contact rates in zone aren't as high as I expected to see them in AAA since his promotion. Maybe some growing pains because he's been really good bat to ball throughout his entire career. Really strong at going the opposite way. Kyle Schwarber has been a pull heavy guy from the moment he stepped foot on a baseball field as a little leaguer, I'm sure. And Moises Ballesteros is terrific at peppering that left center gap as a left-handed hitter. He's been really good about that and really working into some pull side pop over the past couple of years. So he's not that big bopper that's going to go out there and get you 40 home runs a year. He's more of a complete hitter. And so, but I do agree with like your kind of assessment of like, I think that the bat is going to outpace the time frame that it's going to take to really work on his catching skills. I agree with that for sure.
Yeah. I love like the notion of kind of like an eye or an ear test. You mentioned some really great statistical stuff with him, but when you hear Moises Ballesteros hit the baseball, like it has just a very pleasing sound to it. I will say, like he
finds the barrel. He finds really the barrel well. Yeah.
Really well. It reminds me a lot of when we would see Wilson Contreras on the backfields in Arizona, and you would watch him behind the plate, and the arm that he was able to display, that arm talent was just always very clearly there. And you can just say, I see that guy at the big league level. And so I'm really glad that the statistics are kind of telling the same story that the eye and ear test are with Moises Ballesteros. I'm obviously very high on him. We've spent a good chunk of this podcast talking about him. I'm going to now talk about a guy that you love, a guy that you have really waxed poetic about. I know I've brought this up to you, that you just have this ability to weave, verbal pictures about these guys. Alfonsin Rosario absolutely is that guy. Like you called, the fact you called him a prototype right fielder, boy, that made my baseball heart really happy. So I got to ask you, man, at your own leisure, wax poetic about Alfonsin Rosario and why Cubs fans should really keep an eye on him as he continues to progress through the minor leagues.
There's really one main reason, and I've never seen a guy with this much in-game and raw power play at Myrtle Beach during my time covering the Cubs farm system. I haven't seen him. It's unbelievable the amount of power that he's showing. I tweeted a few weeks ago. I tweeted out a leaderboard of home runs hit for the Myrtle Beach franchise back when they were they were a Braves affiliate for a while. They were a Rangers affiliate for a while. And Alfonsin Rosario is like on that leaderboard in terms of home runs hit by a guy that's that young. He's still 19 years old, still super, super young. I saw a picture posted of Alfonsin Rosario recently, and his arms are the size of my thighs. His biceps are. It is unbelievable the amount of raw power he has. Now, he's striking out a ton. He's striking out an awful lot, and that's obviously a red flag. But the fact that he's 19 years old showing this power, and Myrtle Beach is not easy to hit home runs in. That's my point with this whole thing, is that Myrtle Beach is one of the most difficult ballparks in all of minor league baseball to hit home runs in, and he's doing it at 19 years old. He's been playing a lot of center field for the Pelicans this season, and I think that he's fine defensively. He probably ends up in right field. I think that's why I put that prototype of right field. Mm-hmm. But we also kind of said that about Kevin Alcantara, and he's like a really, really strong defensive center fielder. So the speed right now is there for Alfonsin Rosario. I think if he continues to develop and continues to get stronger, which is crazy, he'll probably slow down a bit and kind of mold into that right field template that we expect from him. But he's going to have to limit the strikeouts as he continues to develop, cut down on the swing and miss, all that good stuff. But we saw this from Owen Casey to a certain degree when he was in the lower levels, right? We knew that the pop was there in terms of him hitting the ball really, really hard. And we knew that the swing and miss was there to an extreme amount. Well, Owen Casey has cut down on the swing and miss to acceptable rates as he's kind of climbed the ladder. And really, Alfonsin Rosario is showing off more power than Owen Casey did, because Owen Casey was just like hitting the ball really hard, but it wasn't home run power when he was in Myrtle Beach and South Bend. And even still now a little bit, right? Alfonsin Rosario is hitting the ball out of the ballpark, over the fence, more than what we saw from Owen Casey. He's still got a ways to go. This is not a 2025, 2026 development path for Alfonsin Rosario, but it's just someone that you can get excited about for that 2027, 2028 timeline you were talking about.
Yeah, and we obviously could talk all the live long day about guys who are kind of still on that trajectory. The Christian Hernandez's of the world, I'm sure we could certainly bring them up. So I think maybe we'll draw it back a little bit to the guys that we could see coming up on the Cubs within the next 6 to 12 months. And I know that we talked extensively about Ballesteros, and Cade Horton, I think, is going to end up here at some point. They're not going to want to continue to waste innings from him in those lower levels if they think he's MLB ready. The guy that I think that everybody still talking about, based on his trajectory through the system after he was drafted, was Matt Shaw. And that's a guy that I think I've seen probably about 3 or 4 different kind of like blueprints for how people think his like roadmap's going to go through the minor league level and into the big leagues, where he'll end up playing. If you had to give your best guess on where Matt Shaw kind of fits into the grand scheme of things, whether it's at third base, another position, what he's going to excel at, what do you think is the most likely outcome for a Matt Shaw on his path to the big leagues?
Yeah, I think in terms of we'll start with timeline. I think in terms of timeline for Matt Shaw, I think that he could get called up here in the second half and not look out of place in Chicago. It's going to be dependent on what happens here in a few days with the trade deadline and what openings are there in Chicago and stuff like that. But I started off this season, before the season even started, I started off by saying that we should not expect Matt Shaw to make his MLB debut this year. And I'm kind of standing firm on that. Like, I think I still feel the same way now that I did before the season, where it's like, if he makes his debut, awesome. Like that's great. That's icing on the cake. We'll take it. It'll be fun. We shouldn't expect that to happen, right? Like I think that seeing him early next season is more of an appropriate timeline. As far as positions go, I think he's more of a second baseman than a third baseman. I think he gets the job done at third base. I think he's fine. I think he second base is more of a natural position for him, I think, in terms of his arm and his movements and stuff like that. So give me Matt Shaw at second base, but I think that like I don't know, it depends on the Nico Horner situation, right? It depends on a lot
Yep.
of things have to go right. But I think that he hasn't gotten a whole lot of run in the corner outfields yet. I think that like he'd be fine out there. If you're calling Matt Shaw up to Chicago, it's not for any defensive position situation, right? It's not because like, oh, like he's got to play third base. It's his bat is good. His bat is
Mhm.
really good. And it's been impressive this year, right? I actually have I'm more impressed with Matt Shaw's bat right now, even after the growing pains that he experienced earlier on in the year in Tennessee, than I was at the beginning of this season, right? Because he went through it, man. He got off to a hot start in Tennessee in Double A, and then he went through a stretch. I'd have to look back, maybe almost a month. It was a few weeks where he really struggled in terms of the batting average was way down. He wasn't hitting for power. He was really slumping, but his walk percentage was through the roof. Like he had one of the
Mhm.
best walk percentages in the entire farm system, and that was not something we counted on him before the season started. Right? We thought he was going to be a low walk guy, like sub 5% walk guy, and he was putting up a walk percentage of like greater than 15% during that stretch. So my point there is like he showed ways that he could continue to be a valuable player even as he was slumping at the plate. He came out of it, and now he's hitting the ball hard again. He's showing off some more pull side power. Like I think he's more of a complete hitter than he was at the beginning of the season, and I'm really impressed with Matt Shaw. I think that defensively, it's going to be fine wherever they end up playing. Maybe they bounce him around, right? Maybe he's playing some third, some second, some left and right field. I don't know, but I wouldn't get too carried away, like trying to lock him into third base or trying to
Mm.
or trying to move Nico Horner in order to fit Matt Shaw. We shouldn't be doing that. I think that he'll fit where he fits when the bat's ready, and I think the bat could be ready very soon.
I do want to ask you, is there anybody in kind of that like top 5, top 6 prospect list that you do think is going to be called up to Chicago by the end of the season? Do you see anybody like, I know you mentioned how young some of these guys are, some of the development that still needs to be done, but do you think that any of these guys kind of gets a cup of coffee at the major league level before the season ends?
So I think any of the top 5 guys between Cade Horton, Owen Casey, Matt Shaw, Moises Ballesteros, James Triantos, those are my top 5. Any of those 5, I think could be called up this season, and it wouldn't surprise me. I think that I would see a promotion there and be like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. I don't think I'm expecting any. I worded it on my podcast. I think it was this week where I had a listener question came in and asked like who's going to be promoted, who's going to make their debut from these guys. I would be. I think it's more likely we see 0 of these guys than we see 2 of them
Okay.
for what that's worth, right? Uh, I think we could see 1. Maybe it's Owen Casey at the tail end of the year. Maybe it's Matt Shaw at the tail end of the year. Maybe it's Cade Horton comes back healthier quicker than we thought, and maybe he gets some run in the rotation. Maybe Moises Ballesteros really knocks down the door and it says like, "Hey, you gotta call me up. I have to be hitting in Chicago." And then the other one is James Triantos, right? I think that Triantos, if Nico Horner does get traded at this deadline, I think that I might put James Triantos maybe atop that list in terms of likelihood that they get called up. James Triantos would look perfectly fine in a major league lineup. He would not make a fool of himself at all. Now he's not going to go and post a 120 WRC plus. Like let's not get carried away. But he's going to fit in just fine. He's going to look like he belongs. And so like I could see James Trianto starting at second base for the Cubs at the tail end of the season.
Absolutely love that. And I think that we could probably talk all the live long day about all the trades that could potentially happen, whether it's the Jamison Tyons or the Nico Horners of the world and the impacts that it would have on the Cubs prospect system and guys coming up. But I can't let you get out of here without asking you about the top of the Cubs draft class from this season. And that would be Cam Smith. I've seen a lot of praise of his ability as a third baseman, really intriguing prospect to have within the system. What was your reaction to seeing the Cubs make that pick, and where do you think he's ultimately going to slot in terms of like kind of the top positional players within this system?
Yeah, I was really excited to see the Cubs draft Cam Smith. I had my eye on Cam Smith on the position player side and Trey Savage on the pitching side. Ended up being they ended up both were on the board when the Cubs picked. They ended up going with Cam Smith. I'm going to trust this front office and their ability to draft good players. Like the drafts have been very since the 2021 season, right? Dan Kantrovitz leads the draft. He's the director for the draft, and he came on board before the 2020 draft. 2020, you kind of got to throw out the window. It was a bad draft, but it's also like, yeah, it was a bad draft for everybody. It was a rough situation. But since 2021, when he's been leading the charge, like the drafts have been very, very strong. And so like I believe in their ability to choose Cam Smith over a guy like Trey Savage or anybody else. Cam Smith is good, man. I really like what he brings to the table. I think that he fits a mold of what this front office seemed to draft this year, which was guys that hit the ball really hard and don't swing and miss on pitches in the zone and don't chase all that much. And that's kind of exactly what you want from a Major League Baseball player, right? That's the combination right there. And I think Cam Smith does that really well. There seems to be a lot of confidence in his ability to play third base long term, and I think that's going to be pretty critical. Him playing third base as opposed to first base. Maybe he can play some corner outfield, but I think that not playing first base is going to be key, right? That's always key when you're looking at a bat, is not playing first base, bringing value elsewhere. And I think it's going to be important for Cam Smith. It's worth pointing out that like the timeline that Matt Shaw has been on is not normal, right? The Cubs drafted Matt Shaw last year at 13 overall.
Yep.
The Cubs drafted Cam Smith at 14. So like Cam Smith, Matt Shaw, I can see a lot of comparisons, right? Matt Shaw, the third baseman, Cam Smith, the third baseman. Don't look at Cam Smith and expect him to finish this year in Double-A and be pounding on the door for Chicago next year. Like that's just not reasonable. And so, I mean, if you're looking at a closer to a 2026 timeline, that's fair. I think that's a normal path to go for a college draft pick, not what we're seeing from Matt Shaw. So don't put those expectations on him, but just kind of enjoy the ride. I think that we probably see him at an affiliate this year, whether it's Myrtle Beach or South Bend. And I think there's still some tweaks that need to be made, whether it's his swing path, his load, his setup. I think he's not anywhere near a finished product, but you don't expect any of these guys to be. But it'll be fun watching his development for sure.
Selfishly, as somebody who is running low on frequent flyer miles after a long summer, I'm kind of hoping he ends up in South Bend so I can go check him out a little bit. But wherever he ends up, I'm sure we'll be able to catch him on MLB TV. Greg Huss, host of the Cubs on Deck podcast, co-founder of Northside Bound. Again, you can find his work on X, all of these great prospect breakdowns, and basically telling you everything you're going to need to know about the Cubs minor league system. Greg, it has been an absolutely fantastic 30 minutes that has absolutely flown by, and I really would love to have you back on the show again. Thank you so much for coming on tonight.
I appreciate it, James. Anytime.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you guys for listening to the Cubs Talk podcast.
Congrats, you finished the video. If you want to build on that success, download the NBC Sports Chicago app. It's got highlights, exclusive insights, and push alerts tailored to you. Everything you need to be a real Chicago sports fan. Download it now.